perhaps no movie I anticipated more in my life than Star Wars Episode 3: Revenge of the Sith. I had been a fan of the series since I was 4 or 5, and had seen the previous 2 films in theaters. I read most of the Clone Wars comics, several books, watched the 2003 to 2005 Clone Wars micro-series, played a lot of the video games, ate up the trailers and virtually studied every minute of them, and I even bought the soundtrack and novelization 2 weeks before the film. I convinced my mom to let us do a midnight showing on the day of release, my first ever, and we went as a family complete with plastic lightsabers. No joke, I even distinctly remember having a dream the night before about Anakin being burned alive before becoming Darth Vader. In my mind, there was no way this wasn't going to be the best film ever made. It's funny looking back on it now, given my current feelings about the movie, but I have an awful lot of nostalgia for this one, perhaps more so than any other in the series. I did go to the re-release in April this year, and it was a little surreal seeing a bunch of ecstatic grown men and women who loved the series that never had a chance to see this the first time around, whereas I saw it 6 times back in the day. I say all of that to say this: I was probably never more invested in the series than I was in May 2005, and that's saying something given that I have liked or loved about 80 to 90% of the major projects we've gotten since then, meaning the films, shows, and video games, and would still consider myself a die-hard fan. But as much as this film means to me, it meant way more to George Lucas. His history with the series has been a long one, from its initial creation in the 1970s through the tumultuous making of the original trilogy, which led him to cut down on the number of entries he had planned to make, and then into the freedom of the 90s and 2000s that allowed him to do whatever he wanted. But as a storyteller, being able to see this epic 6-film arc from beginning to end must have been both exciting and bittersweet for him. In one way or another, this was the film Lucas was working towards making for almost 30 years. The actual production of it would begin during the making of Episode 2. Lucas shot some material in Tunisia for the final scene, though he would later reshoot this material. And he gave some broad strokes to Rick McCallum and crew so they could begin conceptual work on the movie. However, they soon ran into a familiar problem. They had no script until very late. McCallum claims he got the finished script 2 days before principal photography. Lucas knew he had to make some vital decisions about what to include and what to leave out, since this had to deliver on the horrific tragedy of Anakin Skywalker and the rise of the Empire at all costs. This meant that a lot of the material he had planned for the third film had to go because it didn't directly serve that story. Eventually, he bit the bullet and did his best to deliver on the central tale. This was the film out of the entire series that transformed the most from script to screen since the original. For example, the original script played much more into the Jedi conspiracy angle and added additional motivations for Anakin to give in to his darkness, such as revealing Dooku orchestrated his mother's death at the hand of the Tusken Raiders, and that Palpatine was in essence Anakin's father because he created him using the midichlorians. However, upon review and reshoots, Lucas whittled it down to the more focused emotional version where the primary factor was Padmé's impending death. After a fairly smooth production process, Lucas's final live-action Star Wars film was released on May 19, 2005, to a great box office intake of $800 million and a much improved critical reception. While we have had many Star Wars films since, this marks the end of an era, as the creator of the franchise saw the series to a reasonably conclusive end, connecting the prequel trilogy to the original and telling a 6-part tale about the Skywalker family. The end of the war draws near. The Separatist army launches a bold attack on Coruscant and captures Chancellor Palpatine. Anakin and Obi-Wan fight their way to the flagship to rescue him. During this rescue, Count Dooku is killed by Anakin's hand and General Grievous escapes. Finally back home on Coruscant, Anakin is reunited with his secret wife Padmé, who reveals she is pregnant. That evening, Anakin receives a vision of her death similar to the ones he had about his mother before her death. Determined to prevent this from happening, Anakin seeks for more knowledge and power. At the same time, the politics of the war at home start to envelop his life. Palpatine is pulling Anakin towards himself with promises of freedom and power, while the Council asks for his loyalty in spying on Palpatine. Knowing that one way will provide him with the life he wants, and the other is the life he has sworn to uphold, surrounded by people who seem to be betraying the very ideas upon which the Order is based, Anakin feels lost in this contest for his soul, and the fate of the entire galaxy will be determined by his choices. Revenge of the Sith overwhelms me for several reasons. One, my own personal attachment to it. Second, the enormous passionate online love and support for it from people my age and younger. And third, it's an ambitious film that serves as the linchpin for the entire saga. It's the culmination of decades of work from Lucas. It contains a deeply personal story and an allegorical tale about how one man can determine the fate of many through a corrupt government. It's about the triumphs of evil and how they will not be permanent. It's about love, loss, friendship, loyalty, betrayal, greed, seduction, and all the things inherent in tragedies. It's the night before the dawn. Oh, and by the way, it's the end of the Clone Wars and sets up the state of the galaxy so the original trilogy can happen. Based on all of this, does it sound like I'm describing a single 133-minute film? To me, it's astonishing Lucas could make a film that has all of this and still cut plenty of material out, such as the birth of the rebellion, the fleshing out of the Jedi conspiracy angle, and dangling story threads like Boba Fett and the mystery of Sifo Dyas. However, this leads into why the film doesn't fully work for me. Delve I shall more fully into where I think the movie went wrong, but it can be broadly summarized with a few statements. It's overly ambitious, trying to do a lot of the work that the previous two films should have done. It's rushed, because Lucas is terrified the audience will be looking at their watches if the film goes over a standard running time. And it's strangely simplified to the point where I feel like I'm missing something despite each scene flowing fairly logically from one into the next. In essence, it's a grand and operatic epic that's condensed to be a leaflet compared to the tome it's screaming to be, and that's because Lucas wrote himself into a corner. Anakin's transformation into Vader is pretty much accomplished in this one film. True, the seeds of this were planted in the other films, but looking at the finished trilogy, I'm left unsatisfied. In Phantom Menace, Anakin's darkness is either a footnote compared to everything else in that film, or done so subtly in the background it's like it's not even there. And Clones is only half focused on Anakin's story because it spends the other half on starting the Clone Wars. So Sith is left to do most of the legwork here, which is a shame because the single biggest reason people seem to want to see this trilogy made was to see Anakin's seduction to the dark side. I get that needs to be spaced out and it can't all be done in one film, nor would I have expected that. But I think because Lucas played the transformation out so slowly over the first two films that the third was left covering too much ground by the time he got to it. And then Lucas shot himself in the foot with his decision to simplify the transformation. In the final film, Anakin turns because his attachment to Padme leads him to seek out forbidden power that the Jedi can't give him. I do love this personal angle and how it evokes the great tragedies of old. He sells his soul to the devil out of love, and his fear of losing her inadvertently leads to her death at his own hands. However, this is only half the story. The film also makes it pretty clear he has intellectual reasons for joining the Sith, so it's not entirely out of emotion. The Council seems to be betraying the very foundation he believes they're built upon by asking him to spy on the Chancellor, who has been nothing but a personal friend and mentor to him. Okay, so far so good. But then the film starts to stumble. For example, Palpatine claims that the Jedi are taking over and that their next move will be to kill all the senators, and Anakin agrees with him. Wait, did I miss something? Why would the Jedi go after the Senate? Obi-Wan plainly states that they served the Senate, and I saw nothing in the scenes with Anakin to suggest that they're plotting a total takeover. Yes, they are keeping things from him, and he hates that and suspects there may be more to it, but what's the connection between that and they wanting to be rulers of the galaxy? Mace trying to kill Palpatine would shake Anakin to his core for a few reasons, but how would he draw the connection between that act, which is a Jedi trying to kill a Sith, and the abolishment of the Senate? I buy Anakin being annoyed and disappointed with the Council, but going all the way to declaring them evil and participating in a massacre? Also, Anakin always brushes off the idea that Palpatine is duplicitous whenever it's brought up, making him feel stubborn beyond my sympathy. Obi-Wan very reasonably states that Palpatine has stayed in office long after his term was up, which is suspicious even if the Senate was behind the move. Padme suggests that Palpatine hasn't done anything to try and end this war through other means, but Anakin dismisses these claims every time. Now, I get that he feels politicians are so caught up in a corrupt bureaucracy that he supports the idea of a dictatorship. And apparently Obi-Wan has had this conversation of duplicitous politicians with him so many times he's sick of it. Is Anakin so enamored with Palpatine's way of ruling that he thinks the man walks on water and is incapable of corruption? Okay, if he does. So when Palpatine reveals he is in fact duplicitous and Anakin has a crisis of conscience, how come he's so willing to give himself to the dark side at the beckoning of a man who's proven that he's not all he appears to be and lies? What else could he be lying about? If it's all because of Padme's impending death, I feel like this is an overly simplified reason for giving up your way of life and destroying an order you admire and have sworn yourself to. Anakin is so single-minded to the point where I struggle to sympathize with his plight. And I don't think you can chalk this all up to Anakin being young and petulant because two different Force users have a high opinion of his intelligence, going so far as to call him gifted and wise. Why am I hung up on this? Because Anakin goes from what have I done in helping to kill Windu to killing children and almost every other Jedi he's ever known in the same night, within 10 minutes of film time. This is such a giant leap to me, and the trilogy hasn't done its job to make me buy this shift from man to monster. Anakin moves with his heart and not his head, which is fine. In fact, some argue that Star Wars is a modern fairy tale, Republic serial, or Greek tragedy, all of which thrive on emotional storytelling. So Anakin making his decisions with his heart makes sense. I'd love to agree with you fully, but the prequels aren't trying to tell the same kind of story as the original trilogy, where simple emotions and logic suffice. They tell a politically charged tale. They introduce the idea that the heroes are not flawless servants of the light, and that our protagonist can fall while still believing he's right. In other words, it wants you to use your brain and take more away than just a simple adventure story about good versus evil. Given the response I've seen supporting this film in just the last month, I know this is fine with a lot of folks. But it doesn't with me because I think it's caught between the two styles of storytelling and can't figure out how to balance it all out. I want to touch on the political side for a bit because I think it's hollow. As I complained with episode 1, the politics are more touched upon, amounting to mere mentions rather than really focusing on them. In any other politically charged story, we would see how democracy is being lost, the ruler tightening his hold on the government, and how the state is being torn apart by war. Now, I'm really trying not to compare this to Andor, which has many times the real estate of this film to tell an involved story that shows why the Empire is evil beyond the grand spectacle of blowing up planets. But we barely get to see the shift from the Republic to the Empire over the course of the trilogy and its effects on the galaxy. We never see the average citizen affected by government changes. We don't see Palpatine subverting the Constitution beyond getting emergency powers in Episode 2. We don't really see the effects of the war on planets touched by war, such as Utapau and Coruscant. Basically, we get a politically charged tale with no real focus on the politics. We hear about it, but we don't actually experience it. It's lip service, which is a big problem I have with several Star Wars films. We are told certain things just to make sure we cover our bases, but we don't get to see them play out. In some instances, like the Bothan stealing the Death Star 2 plans, that's fine. With others, like Palpatine's resurrection, things like that deserve more than the few lines in one film. And given that Sith marks the turning point for both Anakin and the galaxy in preparation for a 20-plus year status quo, and that Lucas was specifically drawn to doing this story because of the political implications, it's a shame that the film doesn't take advantage of this unique opportunity. Not to mention some of the things that were cut out or condensed so we have time for Anakin's simplified story, or other things shoved into the movie that contradict this desire. Lucas wanted a war film, but because he used up 2 films getting to the Clone Wars, those scenes are saved for this film. While I'm fine with them for the most part, the Kashyyyk scenes stand out because I don't see how they furthered the story other than getting Yoda away from Coruscant. Do we really need to see the fight with the Wookiees on screen? Plus, once again, Obi-Wan is taken away from Anakin just so that Anakin can develop more into Darth Vader without his best friend coming in to save him. The other films only showed us a brief moment of Anakin and Palpatine feeling close, so all their important scenes are saved for here, which contributes to me feeling Anakin's attachment to Palpatine is underdeveloped. Not focusing much time on the actual faults of the Jedi and helping to develop the Jedi conspiracy hurts Anakin's development for reasons I already explained. I can understand the formation of the rebellion scenes being cut, though that contributes to the problems with the politics I mentioned earlier. At one point, Lucas had a 4-hour edit of this film, and while that was probably the assembly version of the film that had every single scene shot for filming and never would have been released as a final version, I must point out, this is the version of the film that came after Lucas had decided to cut plot points when he was writing the script that he was saving for this film, like the Sifo Dyas mystery, Boba Fett going after Mace Windu, and a pointless Han Solo edition. So I don't think this film or this trilogy was as planned out as some make it to be. There was an end goal, which is good and important, but an end goal is not the same as a plan, which is what a complicated story like the prequels ultimately needed. To illustrate, I may want to kick the football into the goal to win the game, but how am I going to go about that at each step? And it needs to be a more fleshed out plan than simply get to the end of the field and kick the ball into the goal. By now, you may get the impression that I think this film is a massive dumpster fire. I don't. I think it's severely flawed. But there are plenty of other things I love about the movie. For example, Ewan McGregor does a fantastic job as Obi-Wan Kenobi. I much more buy his character and feel his side of the tragedy than Anakin's. By the end, he loses a brother as well as his entire order, which pretty much amounts to everything important in his life. Yoda straightens him out enough to fulfill his duty as a Jedi to destroy the Sith, and he does that to the best of his knowledge. He doesn't know that Anakin survives Mustafar, of course, but in believing he's done his duty as a Jedi, he allows himself to go into exile until the time comes to pick up the saber again. He still has emotional baggage to sort through after this, which we'll see play out in his own TV show, but for now, he has survived his greatest trial and remained a Jedi in the truest sense. Ewan continues to have charm, nobility, and an earnest desire to do right by his friends and allies. This film in particular cements him as my favorite character of the series. Ian McDiarmid can finally stop sitting on the sidelines and be out front and center here, and it's a joy to watch because he's having fun the entire time. Granted, he gets goofy in places, to the point where I bust a gut at some of his lines when fighting Mace Windu, but the entertainment value he brings to whatever he's doing is immeasurable. When he's being dark and seductive, I find it compelling. When he's reveling in evil, I love to hate him. It's not a perfectly balanced character by any means, but Ian's performance is perfectly judged to play the emotions of every scene, and I can't help but consider him the MVP of the movie. Padme, unfortunately, is treated pretty badly here. After being an active figure in the last two films, she becomes passive so Lucas has time to tell Anakin and Obi-Wan stories. She serves as essentially Anakin's barefoot and pregnant wife because all of her scenes being active, like the rebellion scenes, were cut. Her sole motivation is to be with Anakin and protect the baby, which is such a downgrade. Add to the fact that she dies because she's lost the will to live, and she's effectively ceased to be a three-dimensional character. I've heard arguments that say she was tied to Anakin through the Force, so as Anakin dies, she dies, so it's not as lame as that sounds. However, this is not explicitly supported by the movie and is only supported by a vague notion that could be interpreted in a number of other ways, so I don't believe that's exactly what's going on here. I think Lucas needed to have Padme dead on screen so as to cover his bases as to why she's not in the original films, and came up with a vaguely poetic way to kill her off without risking the twins. Yes, marginalizing her here serves the larger story, but these creative decisions have consequences, and unfortunately the consequences are severe enough to make me question the goodwill I had towards her in the other films. General Grievous is the new bad guy here, and he's fine. I like the idea of him being an old-fashioned villain who poses a menacing image but is in reality a coward, making him feel quite different to the previous two henchmen of Sidious in the trilogy. However, I feel like he's missing something to push him over the edge. Maybe we don't spend enough time with him, but I sometimes have to be reminded he was even part of this story beyond the first act. He doesn't make enough of a mark so that he's one of the first things that comes to mind when I think of the movie. Dooku suffers from a similar problem. He's in the film so little, in this case relegated to one scene, that I completely forget about him until Christopher Lee's name pops up in the credits. I think it's pretty telling that Darth Vader in the suit, who's actually in the film less than either of these two, is all over the poster art for the film, and neither Dooku or Grievous made it onto one of the main theatrical posters. Jimmy Smits gets more to do here as Bail Organa, and I appreciate his presence. He does enough in the few scenes to make me understand why he would make a good father and role model for Leia, and I've loved seeing the character again and again in later projects, even if he was eventually recast in Andor. Yoda is fine. Mace Windu is as much a stick in the mud as he ever was, though he does get an awesome death, and I like that he serves as part of Anakin's defining moment to fully turn him to the dark side. There are other fun presences throughout the film, such as R2, who gets perhaps his funniest stuff to do here, 3PO in his first live-action reveal of the gold plating, Bruce Spence as Tion Medan in one brief scene, and Tamara Morrison as all the clones. Sith is an action-heavy film, and it's mostly great. The opening battle in Coruscant's atmosphere is intense, and a great taste of what we could have seen in the Clone Wars. The lightsaber battles suffer from some of the same problems I mentioned in Episode 2. They occur too often and are unbelievably fast and overly choreographed, but I can't deny the visual spectacle, particularly in the Grievous fight and the Battle of the Heroes. However, this film contains two of my least favorite fights in the series, both involving Sidious. It's not that they're not necessary for the story, it's just that they pale in comparison to others and I find them both a little boring. The second one with him and Yoda is particularly grating on me because it's cutting away from a more interesting fight and I groan every time. Regarding Battle of the Heroes, it's overblown, too choreographed to where I'm not seeing much character in the moves themselves, and it's too long. Plus it has a few moments that make me cringe. However, it's such a visual delight. The main theme behind it is one of my top 5 favorites in the series, and it's a confrontation I've always wanted to see. So I'd still consider it a great fight, though one that has a few things working against it. There's very little to say about John Williams' music in this one. It's terrific as usual, and most films wish they had a score this good. I will say, though, I was a little struck during my last theater viewing about how often music is playing throughout the film. There's rarely a moment of true silence here, though I don't know what to make of that. This is the first time in the series I have to mention the makeup. Star Wars has always had some fine makeup going on, particularly with the aliens, but this is the film that has the best presentation of it, particularly with Anakin being burned. The final result we see is not CGI, and it's astounding. This film rightly got an Oscar nod for its work. The CGI is excellent in some places, and a bit disappointing in others. I still will never understand why an actual clone trooper outfit was never made, and every time I watch certain shots of R2 and the battle droids, they feel quite fake to me. However, certain shots will still leave me awestruck, such as the opening shot of the film, a lot of the Mustafar sequences, and several matte paintings with CGI elements in front like on Coruscant. Though it is noteworthy, this is still the only live-action Star Wars film not to be nominated for a Best Visual Effects Oscar. There are some directing techniques that make me cringe here, such as the shot-reverse shot angles Lucas likes to use during dialogue scenes, and having a character walk off to stare out a window or take in a view in the middle of a conversation. There are a few other things I've never cared for, such as the text of the crawl, the higher-pitched droid voices, some awful moments of cringe in the Anakin and Padme scenes, and the inclusion of Chewbacca. But to close out this review, let's talk about some moments I love. Anakin and Padme's scene at sunset is brilliant. There's almost no dialogue heard, no footage that doesn't in some way relate to the two, and everything is conveyed through facial emotions and with one of the most unique pieces of music in the series. On the eve of the Republic's fall and the demise of the Jedi Order, each person looks to each other, knowing this will likely be the last moment of peace they have and that their lives will be forever changed after tonight. And nothing else needs to be said. It's a beautiful moment. As is Order 66, by the way. I do think the name is stupid and obvious, but I love how it plays out, and it's more or less how it should be handled. Despite my criticism for Padme's treatment in the film, she does get the best line when watching Palpatine transform the Republic into the Empire. Finally, I really appreciate the first half of the film trying to develop the friendship between Anakin and Obi-Wan. Anakin feels far closer to the courageous and reckless hero many of us felt as though he should have been, and Obi-Wan continues a nice development through line in the films. In Episode 1, he is so stiff and hardly emoting until Qui-Gon's death. Throughout the trilogy, he loosens up the more time he spends with Anakin, suggesting he's becoming more of a real person, and I love that subtlety. Revenge of the Sith is an overwhelmingly mixed bag of a film for me. The artistic genius of Lucas is on display here in a way that none of the other films have done before. But there are also a lot of moments where his faults are on display in equal measure. I could write a review 2 to 3 times as long as this and still feel like I've only just barely covered it. For better or for worse, this is a George Lucas film through and through. It takes chances, but several fall so flat on their faces that it diminishes the successes to a degree. I can completely understand if this is a favorite film in the series for you, but I fail to understand where people are coming from when they call this a masterpiece. In the 20 years since this has come out, I've watched the film perhaps more than any other except the original trilogy, and I've listened to hours upon hours of reviews on it, and yet I still find it lacking. Though it's quite a step up from the previous 3 films that I've tackled so far, and it definitely doesn't make Lucas go out on a low note. Since I started this series with episode 1, we're going to continue to look at it in chronological order. So we're now entering the period of spin-offs that takes place during the dark times between episodes 3 and 4. And after examining a trilogy that is essential to the story and covering perhaps the most important individual in the Star Wars universe, isn't it a little odd that currently the next film in the lineup is perhaps the least important and covers a man who is actively staying away from being a savior of the galaxy and spending his time in the underworld organizations of the Star Wars universe? In the wake of the sequel trilogy and subsequent Disney Plus projects, the prequels are perhaps considered to be the last vestige of the true Star Wars for some people. But whatever revisionist history we're seeing from younger fans, make no mistake, the prequels experienced a long and loud backlash right from the get-go. Sure, there were plenty that liked the films, but there was almost an equal amount that disliked or outright hated them. Hyperbole took over a lot of the criticism, and the films were often described as being blights on good cinema. I never thought they were that bad, and I'm glad to see a renewed enthusiasm for them from the fandom at large, enough to where announcements about prequel-related content and the return of actors from the 3 films elicit as much excitement and cheers as does seeing something from the original trilogy. Despite this upward trend of prequel reception, something I believe was spurred on by the 2008 Clone Wars show, I have found that I've been going in the opposite direction as the fandom. Every time I rewatch the prequels, they get worse and worse for me, though I doubt they will ever venture into the land of abominable failure shared by Son of the Mask and The Last Airbender. I appreciate a lot of things about them, particularly their creativity. There's plenty of prequel things I genuinely love, and I adore when current films and series build off from them. But this trilogy overall is my least favorite of the series. A lot of things it tries to do are covered in amateurish fashion. It reeks of someone drunk on creative power and a desire to push the technology of filmmaking at the expense of a story, and while I wouldn't want to see the franchise without them, they definitely have the potential to be more. I will never not have nostalgia for them, and I've never not included at least one prequel in a marathon of Star Wars films, but something's got to form the bottom of the list for me. And despite all their apparent strengths and originality, they are the ones I'm least likely to want to watch. At the very least, though, I can respect their uniqueness and Lucas's efforts to further filmmaking and reduce the amount of compromise a filmmaker needs to have in order to realize their vision. Heck, I could not be making this review series without some of the techniques and technology that he has pioneered. And for that, the prequels have left a positive impact on cinema at large.